Jezreel, we're at the end, both literally and figuratively.
Not the bitter end.
Not the bitter end, of course not.
There's hope at the end.
There's always hope at the end. I hope that will be the end of our message here.
Okay.
We know that the history of Megiddo continues on into the Persian period, but we no longer have access to those stratigraphic remains. The University of Chicago peeled all of that away. So for this episode, I suggest we talk about the latest material that we can have access to. In particular, let's go back to start with to the destruction by the Assyrians, Tiglath-Pileser III, and talk about the last 2 centuries of Megiddo.
Yes, so indeed, we pull back a little bit to our previous talk about, which ended with the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, 732, changing the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrian Empire becoming far more aggressive than before under Tiglath-Pileser III, and he conquers, all these territories in the north, not only here in the Northern Kingdom, also in Syria, and he takes over the Galilee part, the northern valleys included of the Northern Kingdom in 732, which means that the Northern Kingdom survives 10 or 12 more years until the capital Samaria is taken over a bit later, but this is the first blow in 732. And it is really interesting to see that there is no total destruction of the city. So here and there we have evidence for destruction, and there are other places, perhaps including here behind us, the evidence perhaps is less clear. And it should not come as a surprise, because when an empire comes to a place like this, there is a pre-plan, some sort of pre-plan. They know what they need, and why should they destroy everything if they want to exploit and to establish, a province of the empire later? So they need to keep them alive in a way. So there is, so this is basically what we see. We see partial destruction of the Israelite city, and we spoke about it. And then we have the Assyrian city at Megiddo. We really don't know for the time being whether the Assyrian city was constructed right away. Let's say immediately after 732, perhaps in the time of Sargon II in the late 8th century. When exactly, we do not know, but we know that they changed the layout of Megiddo completely, and they made Megiddo the center of an administrative district, the district of Megiddo. And so what we see on the ground from the excavations of the University of Chicago is basically the plan of the entire city. And it's really fascinating because it's different from everything that we knew before. Another revolution, we spoke during our 8 clips about revolutions in the history, layout revolutions.
Yeah.
In the history of Megiddo. This is the last one, if you wish, that we get what we describe as hippodamic plan. So this is Little Manhattan of Megiddo,
Right.
in the 7th century BC. The meaning is that the streets crisscross in right angle, and they make insula of structures, and they're all like this, in an American city. In a downtown in an American city, and this is really fascinating. For the first time, we see something like this here in the land of Israel. So, there's a lot to speak about it, but we can just push it aside for a minute.
Sure.
And then they construct a new gate, and they really make huge fields in order to elevate the whole thing, because this is an empire coming and reorganizing Megiddo, and they construct 2 palaces. The big question is whether the 2 palaces represent one phase in the history of Assyrian Megiddo or 2 phases, whether they are from the same moment. We try to struggle with this question. Both of them are of a sort of Mesopotamian layout in a way, and you can identify definitely Assyrian features in the architecture of the palaces. Also, we, in the very beginning of our excavations here in 1994, tried to struggle with the palaces, and we published also several Assyrian-like features, even things which are completely similar to items found, in Mesopotamia, at Khorsabad, for instance, one of the important capitals of Assyria in the northeast. So this is the Assyrian city. Now the Assyrians, unfortunately, we have no indication of an Assyrian administration. This is surprising, by the way. You would have thought that you'll find some sort of a cuneiform tablet. And we have in this country cuneiform tablets of the later period, of this period. In two in Gezer, there is one or two at Hadid. There are several places, and not at Megiddo. So how to explain this? Very difficult. I am trying to find an excuse, and I see myself, in my dream, I see the commander of Assyria, of the Assyrian city, telling them, guys, we have to pull out. Time has come because we have a new enemy in the north, and we have to struggle in the north. So we evacuate the beautiful Jezreel Valley, pack all documentation. So they put everything on the back of donkeys and they go. I mean, this is the situation. Well, now, the Assyrians were here for about a century, starting 732, constructing maybe 720. The pullout, according to all scholars today, around 630 BC, 630 BC, perhaps a year or two later. And the pullout is interesting because it is connected to somebody, to an empire which inherits the Assyrian territories. The Egyptian empire of the old young empire of the 26th dynasty, the Said dynasty of Egypt. The first famous king is Psammetichus, of course, and then the others, and Necho is the one who is related to this place. In any event, they inherit. And the situation is interesting because, it's like the Middle East today. We in Israel are enemies with Egypt one year, and then after 20 years, we are friends with Egypt against somebody else, and, there are new alliances. And, all this is under the umbrella of an American empire. So things in the Middle East were the same also then, because Egypt was the enemy of Assyria and vice versa before, and Assyria even took parts of Egypt in the delta.
Right.
But then there is a new enemy, a common enemy. So they align against the common new enemy, Babylonia. So the Egyptians inherit the place peacefully from Assyria. And then there is also a Babylonian phase. So this is the background for what happens after 732, Assyria, Egypt, Babylonia.
How does this historical overview get translated to Megiddo?
To the side, to the ground.
That's right, archaeologically.
Yeah, we need to tie to the ground. And here we face a major problem. We need to reflect back on our first clip about, the introduction to Megiddo. And we said that the idea of this expedition, the program was to reinvestigate Megiddo from bedrock all the way up to the surface, including these later periods.
Right.
The problem is that the University of Chicago, when they started working here, in the first years, their idea was to peel off the site layer by layer. So, in fact, when we look at the surface of the site, also here, what the camera sees, we already miss the later phases.
Right.
So we were in a problem because we do want to have the material culture assemblages of the phases after. And there is another thing, that not only at Megiddo, in the entire north, we do not know enough about the material culture, including pottery and other items of the 7th and 6th centuries. In Judah, we know perfectly, because we have the phase between the, let's say, the Sennacherib destructions and the early 6th century, including Jerusalem destruction. But here, we are in a big question mark, and this is really some sort of a lacuna, in the archaeology of Israel, in the Iron Age, and even the general picture. So we said to ourselves, we need to contribute something here, first of all, to our understanding of Megiddo, and then the border issue. So we started looking for a place. The first place was Area Q over there. Very quickly, we found out that there's nothing. It was already taken out by Chicago, and we had wonderful finds from Area Q, and many articles were written, but not on this.
Right.
And then Asaf Kleiman, who is running this area behind us, and me sat down and looked at the beautiful balloon pictures of the University of Chicago, where you can see every detail. And we noticed that there is a small hump here.
Okay.
And we said, maybe this hump preserves these later remains. Maybe they neglected, to take this out. We started excavating here. This is why we are sitting here, Matt.
I guess so.
To see this, what's behind us. So we started here in 2016 and then 18 and then now. And we indeed are lucky. We have here a wonderful sequence of the period after the destruction of Israel, possibly including the Assyrian phase, and definitely a bit later in the 7th century into the beginning of the 6th century. And we are in motion here. We are going to have more finds, and the finds are fascinating. Here we have, like, for the time being, 5 phases, and perhaps all 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them, belong to this post-732 situation. So this is great, with floors, material on the floors. So we will be able to use this in order to better understand Megiddo, but much more than that. We can use this in order to shed light on the archaeology, material culture, and therefore history of the entire region. Let me give you one small example. Okay. There were surveys here in the Galilee in the 70s, and the surveyor, Tzvi Gal, was a very good one, you know, suggested, according to what he knew at that time, that basically the Galilee was deserted. People were deported, and there is a huge decline demographically and in the settlement history with the Assyrian takeover. But maybe this needs to be checked afresh.
Sure.
Asaf wants to check this afresh, and rightly so. This needs to be checked afresh according to what we see here behind us. So now, for the time being, we have also the sequence of material culture, of archaeology after 732.
Give us a few examples of some of the interesting finds that you're referring to here.
Absolutely. So, I mean, some of the finds are not very beautiful, but important because they see the changes, you know, in the pottery traditions and so on. But there is one thing, one layer here. We are speaking here behind us about 5 layers. This is area X. So we have X1, X2, X3, X4, X5. X3 is extremely important because we have here a very interesting cocktail of finds. We already in 2016 identified pottery, which is described by all of us as East Greek.
Okay.
Typical of the second half of the 7th century, so between 650 and 600 BC. It's you cannot miss it once you see it. And this pottery is known from several other sites, but usually on the coast, not so much inside, inland. And it was quite a surprise for us to see this pottery here. We carried out a neutron activation analysis of for the origin of the pottery. And the pottery comes from Miletus. So it's really East Greek in the sense of the coast of Asia Minor. Miletus is in the western coast of Asia Minor, and it is in Lydia. When we speak, when we speak about the Lydians, when we speak about, you know, pre-classical, if you wish, Greek world and Anatolia. So this you have to keep in mind, in the back of your mind, because we'll get back to it. And then in the same layer, together with the East Greek pottery, lo and behold, we have Egyptian pottery.
Ah, wow.
Yeah, so this is the what I call the wonderful cocktail. Think about it, Egyptian pottery with East Greek. Now, why is this so important and why is this so interesting?
Herodotus.
Exactly. We have the historical records which tell us that at that time there were Greek mercenaries serving in the Egyptian military and in the Egyptian army. So, for instance, Ashurbanipal tell us about this king of Lydia, Gyges, who sends mercenaries to Egypt. We have, by the way, evidence for these mercenaries in Egypt, in the archaeology of Egypt, which is interesting. We have, by the way, evidence from the coast of Israel, a site a little bit to the south of Tel Aviv, which is related, Metzad Chashavyahu, which is related to this story of Egyptian forces and perhaps Greek mercenaries, Greek in the sense of Asia Minor as well.
Sure.
And then there is Herodotus, and he tells us about, of course, a bit later. Herodotus is in the 5th century, but he reflects back and tells us about the 7th century BC. And this is also interesting. And I think that these, in my opinion, there are places in the Bible where there are hints at this phenomenon of Greek mercenaries, perhaps Greek hoplites, known to the biblical author, known to the Deuteronomistic author who composes the Book of Kings. For instance, let me give you one example, the description of the armor of Goliath in the Book of Samuel, which reminds one very much of a Greek hoplite rather than a warrior of the Mycenaean times, or if you wish, or something like that. How to explain the phenomenon of East Greek pottery found here in the Levant? One way is to say that this is simply trade, right?
Yeah.
But there is another voice because of Metzad Chashaviyahu, this fort south of us near Tel Aviv, and because of other reasons, to associate this East Greek pottery with these Greek mercenaries in the service of Egypt in the late 7th century BC. So things start to close here. I mean, in the geopolitical picture.
This isn't normally my thing to immediately jump to the biblical text, but I'm a little bit tempted to connect this Greek mercenary pottery, Egyptian pottery, to the story of Josiah in the Bible.
Yes, my dear Matt, there's no way to avoid this. There's this fascinating tradition in the Bible, in two places, of the killing of King Josiah of Judah, here at Megiddo, in 609 BC, by King Necho of Egypt of the 6th dynasty. I mean, we are in the same slot chronologically, exactly. Right. Which means in the late 7th century. We were speaking about the late 7th century. Now, this tradition is important. Sometimes I'm telling people who come with me here to Megiddo, forget about Solomon, forget about, I don't know, Thutmose III or Biridia, king of Megiddo in the late Bronze Age. The most important single event at Megiddo from our culture point of view in the 21st century is this moment in 609, because it has to do with the beginning of eschatology and messianism in Judeo-Christian tradition. So this is really important. So here's the story. Two stories, in fact.
Okay.
One in the Book of Kings, one in the Book of Chronicles. Now, in a situation, and they tell different stories. The Book of Kings is very cool. It says, if you read it very carefully, Necho summons Josiah to Megiddo, something goes wrong, and he kills him. He executes Josiah on the spot here at Megiddo in 609. Chronicles gives us a story about a battle, that Josiah came with an army and there was a battle with Necho, and Josiah died in battle and was taken to be buried in the tombs of the Davidites in Jerusalem.
Sounds more heroic, I suppose.
Yeah, sounds very heroic, but Judah could not really put a fight with an Egyptian empire of the 26th dynasty. And also, more important perhaps, Chronicles was put in writing late, some say 4th or 3rd centuries. I would say that parts of Chronicles, which do not appear in Kings, perhaps even in the 2nd century BC, completely different ideology, completely different needs to explain things.
Right.
So we need to stick to Kings. Josiah comes here, executed on the spot. So this is interesting, really, and connects now, first of all, to the ground.
You find
Maybe.
Josiah?
Not yet. Maybe connects to the ground. I'll tell you why. You remember we spoke 3 minutes ago, about this cocktail of Egyptian pottery with the East Greek pottery, perhaps related to mercenaries in the Egyptian army here at Megiddo, and we are exactly in the slot which fits 609 BC, one way or the other, apparently. We need to check this still further, but I mean, as a framework, I would say. And in the Bible, there are several hints in Ezekiel and in Jeremiah that Greek soldiers, one way or the other, were associated with the killing of Josiah at Megiddo. And even perhaps if we understand well, and it's very vague, there is this chapter in Jeremiah specifically referring to Lydians.
Okay.
And also the tradition of Gog and Magog is, perhaps related to Giges and therefore to Lydia and therefore to the mercenaries. I mean, it takes a lot of ifs and it takes a lot of interpretation. And we scholars are running away sometimes from interpretation, but sometimes you have to say to yourself, well, hey, say the things and then we'll see.
Right.
Okay? So we are saying the things. So perhaps we have here the connection. We wrap it up as the connection of Josiah being killed because of something went wrong. He came here. He was probably asked to swear alliance to the new suzerain, Necho here after the Assyrian pullout. He had other ideas. He did not understand well the geopolitical situation here. This happens a lot in the Middle East, of not understanding the bigger picture. He made a mistake and he paid with his life for the mistake.
So you mentioned that this death of Josiah was so important to modern Judeo-Christian thought and culture. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I mean by that this happened in 609 BC. Already as early as the later layer in the book of Zechariah in the Hebrew Bible, there is reference which perhaps speaks about an eschatological battle. The forces, what is eschatology? The forces of God will fight the forces of evil. The forces of God will prevail and we will all be redeemed, So this is basic in Judaism, in early Judaism. You see this very clearly, perhaps starting indeed with Zechariah, post-exilic Zechariah, and then in Apocrypha of the late 3rd, 2nd century BC into the scrolls. And then, of course, we come to another point, which is the book of Revelations in the New Testament. So there's this idea that I would translate it in the following way. I would interpret it or understanding in the following way. There is the idea of Armageddon. Okay, Armageddon is the Greek corruption of Har Megiddo, the Mound of Megiddo. So hey, all of a sudden, Megiddo, that is already deserted for several centuries in the time that John of Patmos is active in Patmos and writing Revelations in the 1st century, So then all of a sudden, Megiddo is back to life, as the centerpiece of eschatology and messianism. So what's going on? Did he invent it? No, he did not. So perhaps the tradition goes from a short while after the death of Josiah. Josiah is described in the Bible as the most righteous of all kings of Judah and Israel combined. He is the absolute, the most righteous monarch. He is more righteous than David, mind you. Okay, if you look at the details,
Sure.
David is. Would you marry your daughter to David?
No.
Okay, but Josiah perhaps.
Sure.
But Josiah, they say that he walked in the path of the God of Israel without striding to the right and without striding to the left. And they even make some sort of a comparison of him to Moses, the only king. So perhaps the idea is the following, that in the future, from the place where the most righteous king of all Davidites, of the lineage of David, of the dynasty of David, died, from the same place, there will be an eschatological battle. The forces of God will prevail, and a new Davidite will emerge to help to save us all, to redeem us all. So if you remember, we started this episode and I told you that I'm going to give you some hope.
Doesn't sound very hopeful.
It is hopeful. At the end, things will be okay.
Okay.